Disclaimer.
Tomorrow is a day most Americans have never heard of. It has no name you'd recognize, no countdown clock on CNBC, no trending hashtag, no breathless news segment. But inside the tight, high-stakes world of commodity trading, February 27th carries a weight that has kept certain vault managers awake all week. It's called First Notice Day, the moment when holders of March Comex silver futures can formally step forward and demand real physical silver be delivered to them. Not a contract, not a digital entry, not a settlement check. Actual silver bars, stamped and certified, sitting in a vault with their name on the delivery ticket. And here's the problem that almost nobody is talking about. The silver may not be there. Let's back up for a moment, because to understand why tomorrow matters so much, you need a clear picture of what Comex actually is, and why the numbers hiding inside it right now are unlike anything we've seen in recent memory. Comex, the commodity exchange, is the beating heart of American precious metals pricing. It's where silver futures are bought and sold, where industrial manufacturers hedge their supply needs months in advance, where the rest of the financial world looks when it wants to know what silver costs. When your jeweler prices a ring, when a solar panel manufacturer forecasts their material budget, when a central bank calculates reserve values, they're all, in some way, anchored to what happens on this exchange. Comex doesn't just reflect the silver market. For most practical purposes, it is the silver market. But Comex has developed a vault problem, a serious one. Back in October 2025, registered silver inventory, meaning the metal that's officially available for delivery, the bars with active delivery tickets attached, sat at a reasonably functional 167 million ounces. Not historically enormous, but workable. Enough cushion to absorb normal delivery pressure and keep the system humming. Then, quietly and without any headlines, something began to change. Day after day, silver started leaving those registered vaults. Some bars shifted from registered to eligible status, meaning they were still physically present in the building, but no longer available for immediate delivery, essentially parked rather than posted. Others departed the system entirely. The drain has been running at roughly 785,000 ounces per day. And by this week, that registered inventory has collapsed to approximately 85 million ounces. In 4 months, nearly half the deliverable silver backing America's most important commodity exchange has quietly vanished from the available column. Think about what that actually means in plain terms. If you walked into a bank and discovered that half the cash in the vault had been quietly moved to a room marked not currently accessible, you'd want some answers. That's essentially what's been happening in the Comex silver vaults since the fall, and almost no one in mainstream financial media has treated it as the story it is. Now here's where the numbers start to feel genuinely uncomfortable. Sitting against those 85 million ounces of real deliverable silver is a towering stack of paper. March silver open interest on Comex currently represents somewhere between 429 and 500 million ounces of contractual obligations. Every single one of those contracts is a legal commitment, a binding promise to either deliver or accept delivery of silver at the agreed price. In theory, and historically in practice, the vast majority of those contracts never trigger a physical delivery demand. Most traders roll their positions forward to the next contract month. Others take cash settlements. The whole system is built on the comfortable assumption that only a small slice of paper claims will ever translate into someone actually showing up at the vault with a dolly. But what if that assumption breaks down, even partially? Hold this number in your mind, 25%. If just 1/4 of a current March open interest holders decide they want physical metal, which is, let's be clear, exactly what their contracts legally entitle them to demand, the math produces a delivery requirement of roughly 107 million ounces. 1/4. A conservative, historically plausible fraction. And 107 million ounces demanded against 85 million available means the vault runs out before every legitimate claimant gets satisfied. We're not theorizing about some radical speculative scenario here. We're describing what happens when a modest, reasonable percentage of contract holders simply exercise their contractual rights. The system, as currently structured, cannot fulfill them. Push that demand rate to 50% and the gap becomes a canyon. 215 million ounces needed against 85 million in the vault. And if March delivery rates come anywhere close to what we actually observed in February 2025, when roughly 98% of contracts resulted in delivery requests, you're looking at a demand of 420 million ounces against an 85 million ounce inventory. That's not a squeeze in the traditional sense of the word. That's a structural rupture, the kind that forces emergency responses, rule changes, and the uncomfortable conversation about whether the price on the screen still means anything. Now, you might reasonably ask, hasn't Comex navigated tight delivery situations before? The honest answer is yes. But here's the critical detail that changes everything about this particular moment. Every time Comex has faced serious delivery pressure in the past, 2 emergency supply valves existed to relieve it. 2 reliable sources of physical silver that could be unlocked when the vaults ran low and the pressure built. The system wasn't designed to be self-sufficient. It was designed to function with the assumption that these external flows were always available. For the first time in modern market history, both emergency valves have been sealed shut at the same time. Not one, both. The first is China. For years, Chinese silver, produced in vast quantities and stored in Shanghai Futures Exchange warehouses, has served as a pressure release mechanism for Western markets. When Comex vaults ran tight, metal could move through approved channels from Chinese refineries and storage facilities into the global supply chain, giving American vaults a chance to replenish without a crisis. This pipeline operated quietly in the background, invisible to most American investors, but absolutely essential to the stability of the system we all depend on. As of today, February 26, 2026, China has effectively locked that pipeline. The Shanghai Futures Exchange has restricted silver export licenses to just 44 approved firms, each required to maintain a minimum $30 million credit line just to qualify. That's not a procedural adjustment. That's a velvet rope around the warehouse. And the timing, combined with new position limits taking effect tomorrow that force speculative traders to liquidate near-term contracts, makes this look far less like coincidence and far more like coordination. China isn't releasing a pressure valve. China is building pressure of its own, and we'll unpack exactly why in the next chapter. The second emergency valve is Mexico, and this one connects the abstract world of futures contracts to a very real, very human story unfolding just south of our border right now. Mexico is not a peripheral player in silver. It is the single largest silver-producing nation on Earth, accounting for approximately 28% of global mine supply, according to TD Cowen research published just days ago on February 25th. When Comex has historically needed emergency physical supply on short notice, Mexican silver has been the most accessible and realistic option, mined in the rich deposits of Zacatecas, Durango, and Sonora, refined domestically, and transportable to American vaults with relative efficiency. It was a buffer that industry insiders understood and quietly relied on, even if it never made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. 4 days ago, that buffer was effectively destroyed. On February 22nd, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the feared leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, was killed. What followed was swift, violent, and geographically sweeping. Cartel retaliation has shut down commercial road transport across 20 Mexican states. Mining engineers have been evacuated from active sites in the heart of silver country. Transport convoys have stopped moving. And in a detail that matters enormously for anyone trying to physically move silver northward right now, cargo insurance for Mexican mining shipments has become nearly impossible to obtain. No underwriter wants to price a policy for freight crossing territory where armed conflict is actively ongoing. So here is the full picture heading into tomorrow's first notice day. We have a Comex vault holding roughly 85 million ounces of registered silver against contractual obligations that could legally demand multiples of that amount. We have China, the primary historical emergency supplier, closing its doors and restricting exports to a tiny circle of approved institutions. And we have Mexico, the world's biggest silver producer and America's most practical emergency supply route, functionally shut down by cartel violence that erupted less than a week ago. 3 converging forces, 1 delivery deadline, a vault that was already bleeding inventory before any of this began. What happens when a system engineered around the assumption that emergency supply will always materialize meets a moment where every emergency supply route is closed simultaneously? We haven't seen this exact combination before, and the answer, the real mathematical no-spin answer, is what the next chapter is going to reveal in full detail. Because the data trail is there, the insider moves have already been made, and the numbers, as they always do, are telling the truth whether the futures price reflects it yet or not. There's a version of this story where everything we just described is coincidence, where China's export restrictions are routine bureaucratic housekeeping, where Mexico's transport shutdown is a temporary disruption that resolves itself in a week, where the Comex vault drain is just normal seasonal repositioning, and the paper-to-physical ratio is nothing to lose sleep over. That version is comfortable. It requires no action, no rethinking, no uncomfortable questions about the systems our economy depends on. But the data doesn't support that version. And once you see the evidence laid out in sequence, the comfortable explanation starts to feel less like reassurance and more like denial. Let's start with China, because what's happening there is not a policy adjustment. It's a strategic repositioning, and the details reveal exactly where Chinese leadership believes this metal is going. The Shanghai Futures Exchange's decision to restrict silver export licenses to just 44 approved firms isn't the headline. The headline is the credit requirement attached to those licenses, a minimum $30 million credit line per firm just to qualify for export authorization. Think about what that threshold does in practice. It doesn't just screen out small players. It creates a deliberately narrow channel that Beijing can monitor, control, and throttle at will. Of the thousands of firms that move commodities through Chinese markets, only a curated handful now have the legal standing to export silver. That's not streamlining, that's a choke point, engineered by design. And the timing of the new position limits, effective February 27th, first notice day itself, adds another layer of intention. These limits force speculative traders holding near-term silver contracts on the Shanghai Futures Exchange to liquidate their positions before delivery pressure peaks. What does that accomplish? It clears the deck of short-term paper noise, reduces the chance of a chaotic domestic scramble for metal, and ensures that whatever silver remains in Chinese storage stays available for the buyers Beijing actually wants to serve. The question worth asking is, who are those buyers? The answer lives in China's own economic planning documents, and in the industrial build-out happening right now across the country. China's solar panel manufacturing capacity has expanded at a pace that strains description. The country now produces roughly 80% of the world's solar panels, and every single one of those panels requires silver for its electrical contacts and conductive pathways. According to the Silver Institute's most recent industrial demand data, solar applications alone consumed over 200 million ounces of silver globally in 2024, and Chinese manufacturers accounted for the dominant share of that demand. Now, layer in the electric vehicle expansion. China sold more than 11 million EVs in 2024, each requiring silver for battery management systems, charging contacts, and electronic controls. And you start to understand why Beijing isn't interested in exporting its silver stockpile to bail out a foreign commodity exchange. China isn't restricting exports because it has less silver than it needs. China is restricting exports because it has plans for every ounce it holds, and those plans serve Chinese solar farms, Chinese EV factories, and Chinese strategic reserves, not Comex delivery obligations. That's not a criticism, that's a rational national economic strategy. But for our market, it means the emergency tap has been turned off by someone who needed the water for themselves. Now let's talk about Mexico, because the situation there has moved faster and harder than most American investors realize, and the downstream consequences for physical silver supply are severe in ways that the spot price hasn't yet absorbed. Mexico's Fresnillo, Peñoles, and First Majestic operations, names that don't make American dinner table conversation but absolutely drive global silver supply, are concentrated in a geographic corridor that overlaps almost perfectly with the states, most affected by the current cartel retaliation. Zacatecas, the single most silver-rich state in the country, has seen highway blockades and armed checkpoints appear within days of El Mencho's killing. Durango, the second largest producing state, has reported engineering staff evacuations from at least 3 major active mines. Sonora, which feeds a significant portion of the silver that eventually reaches North American refineries, is under the same transport paralysis affecting its neighbors. T.D. Cowen's research note from February 25th quantified what this means at the macro level. Mexico supplies 28% of annual global silver mine production. That's not a rounding error. That's more than 1 in 4 ounces of silver mined anywhere on Earth, coming from a country that is currently, right now, functionally unable to move that metal from mine to refinery to port. Even a 30-day disruption, a timeline that looks optimistic given the scope of the current violence, removes a quarter of global supply from any realistic replenishment scenario for Comex vaults. A 60-day disruption starts to look like a redrawing of the global supply map. But here's the detail about Mexico that the raw supply statistics alone don't capture: the insurance market. Physical commodity transport doesn't just require trucks and roads. It requires underwriters willing to price the risk of moving valuable cargo through uncertain territory. Those underwriters have, almost unanimously, pulled back from Mexican silver transport coverage since February 22nd. When you can't insure a shipment, reputable logistics firms won't move it. When reputable logistics firms won't move it, the metal sits at the mine. This isn't a problem that resolves when the roads reopen. It resolves when insurers regain confidence in the security environment, which historically lags the actual stabilization of violence by weeks or months. So the China tap is closed by design, and the Mexico tap is closed by chaos. And while those two external valves were being sealed, something else was happening inside the market that deserves your full attention. Because it tells you what the most sophisticated buyers in the world were already doing before any of this became public knowledge. In October 2025, 4 months before First Notice Day, before El Mencho's killing, before China's export restrictions made headlines, Samsung C&T, the trading and investment arm of one of the world's most strategically sophisticated conglomerates, quietly prepaid $7 million to lock in 100% of the output from La Parrilla mine in Durango, Mexico, for 2 full years. Read that again. 100% of a major Mexican silver mine's production paid in advance, contracted directly, bypassing Comex entirely. Samsung wasn't buying silver futures. Samsung was buying the silver itself, at the source, before anyone else could get to it. This is not an isolated corporate quirk. It's part of a pattern that Federal Reserve market analysts and commodity strategists have been tracking with growing attention. Tesla has been securing direct silver supply agreements with South American miners to feed its battery and charging infrastructure production. Apple has done the same, building direct procurement relationships for the silver used in its device components and connectors. These are not companies that make supply chain decisions casually. They have entire divisions of analysts, geologists, and logistics engineers whose sole job is to ensure that the materials their products depend on will be available when needed. And when Samsung, Tesla, and Apple are all simultaneously moving to lock in physical silver outside of the exchange system, it's worth asking what they know that the average investor doesn't. And then there's the CME Group itself, the parent company of Comex, which has provided what may be the most honest signal of all. Since January of this year, CME has tripled the margin requirements on silver futures contracts, raising them from approximately 9% to 18%. Margin requirements are the exchange's primary tool for managing delivery risk. When the exchange nearly doubles its margin rate in the span of a few weeks, it is, in the most direct language available to it, telling the market that the risk of a delivery problem has materially increased. Exchanges don't triple margins as a precaution against theoretical scenarios. They do it because their own internal risk models are flashing warnings they can no longer responsibly ignore. There's a concept in financial analysis called smart money behavior. The idea that large, sophisticated, well-informed actors often position themselves ahead of major market moves before those moves are visible in headline prices. What we're describing here isn't speculation about hidden motives or conspiracy theories. It's a straightforward observation. The entities with the deepest knowledge of physical silver markets, a Korean industrial giant, two of the world's most valuable technology companies, and the commodity exchange itself, have all, in the last 4 months, taken concrete actions that only make sense if they expected physical silver to become significantly harder to obtain through normal channels. Samsung locked in a mine, Tesla and Apple locked in supply chains, CME locked in higher margins, and China locked its export door. These aren't random events occurring in isolation. They form a coherent picture of actors at every level of the silver supply chain preparing for a moment that, as of tomorrow morning, is no longer approaching. It has arrived. The vault holds 85 million ounces. The contracts claim multiples of that. The emergency suppliers are both unavailable, and the sophisticated money moved months ago. What happens next isn't a mystery, it's arithmetic. And the final chapter is where we run those numbers all the way to their conclusion. Numbers don't have opinions. They don't care about market sentiment, analyst ratings, or what the television says silver should be worth. When the math of a delivery system breaks down, it breaks down the same way every time, predictably, measurably, and with consequences that ripple outward from the vault floor to the retail coin dealer to the solar manufacturer to the investor sitting at their kitchen table wondering why their purchasing power feels like it's slowly evaporating. So let's do the math together, all of it. Because you deserve to see the full picture, not a softened version of it. We have 3 scenarios, and every single one of them produces a shortfall. The conservative scenario, the one that assumes delivery demand stays at just 25% of open interest, a modest fraction well within historical norms, requires 107 million ounces of physical silver. The vault holds 85 million. That's a 22 million ounce gap on the conservative end. Now consider the moderate scenario, 50% delivery demand, still not unusual in a market where physical buyers are growing increasingly skeptical of paper promises. That scenario requires 215 million ounces against 85 million available, a 130 million ounce shortfall. And then there's the scenario that mirrors what actually happened in February 2025, when delivery demand ran at roughly 98% of open interest. At that rate, March contracts would demand 420 million ounces. Against 85 million in the vault, that's a 335 million ounce gap. There is no rounding error or revised estimate that closes a gap of that size. There is no emergency restock that arrives fast enough. At that point, the system isn't under pressure. The system has failed its most basic function. What does Comex do when it can't deliver? It has done this before, and the playbook is well documented. The exchange shifts to cash settlement, meaning instead of handing over silver bars, it hands over dollars calculated at the official spot price. On paper, the contract holder gets paid. In practice, they get paid in a currency that buys them less silver than their contract entitled them to receive, because the act of mass cash settlement itself signals to the physical market that real metal is unavailable at the posted price. And when physical metal is unavailable at the posted price, dealers, the people who actually hold silver coins, bars, and rounds in their inventories, stop selling at the posted price. They add a premium. And that premium is where the real story starts to get personal for everyday Americans. When Comex resorts to widespread cash settlement, the physical silver market begins trading at a significant premium above spot price. We're not talking about the normal $1 to $2 per ounce dealer markup you'd see on a routine purchase. We're talking about a 20 to 40% premium above whatever number the futures market is flashing on your screen. What that means in practice is that two separate silver markets emerge simultaneously. A paper market that still quotes one price and a physical market where the metal that actually exists changes hands at a fundamentally different, higher price. If you want a number on your screen to look at, it might say $32 an ounce, but if you want to actually hold silver in your hand, the dealer tells you $40, maybe $45. And the gap between those two numbers is the most honest expression of how broken the delivery mechanism has become. This isn't a theoretical future state we're speculating about. It happened during the 2020 COVID disruption, when physical silver premiums surged above $8 per ounce, even as the spot price briefly crashed. It happened during the 2021 Wall Street Bets silver squeeze, when retail demand overwhelmed dealer inventory and premiums spiked to $6 to $10 above spot within 72 hours. Both of those episodes occurred in markets where emergency supply routes were still open, where China hadn't restricted exports, and where Mexico was still shipping. And we're describing something that starts from a structurally weaker position than either of those events. Now, let's revisit Mexico one final time, because the transport disruption there isn't just a supply story, it's a timeline story. And the timeline matters enormously for understanding how long this pressure can sustain. Historical analysis of major cartel disruption events in Mexico, the 2019 Guanajuato fuel theft crackdowns, the 2020 Michoacan escalations, the 2022 Zacatecas conflicts, shows that full commercial transport normalization after significant leadership killing typically takes 45 to 90 days at minimum. Insurance markets, which as we discussed have already largely withdrawn from Mexican silver transport coverage, tend to reprice risk even more slowly, often 60 to 120 days behind the actual stabilization of the security environment. That means even if the violence peaked yesterday and began de-escalating today, which there is no evidence of, the realistic timeline for Mexican silver flowing freely again runs well into April or May. And here's why that matters to the Comex math. Every day that Mexican supply remains frozen, the 85 million ounce registered inventory continues draining at its current 785,000 ounce per day pace with no external replenishment. A 30-day Mexico disruption doesn't just remove 28% of global silver supply from the emergency options, it removes it precisely during the window when Comex needs it most, while simultaneously allowing the vault to keep bleeding. A 60-day disruption pushes all three of our delivery shortfall scenarios deeper and removes any reasonable expectation of a soft landing through gradual restocking. The longer the cartel disruption holds, the more our conservative scenario starts to look like the optimistic one. So, what do you actually watch to know whether this is unfolding in real time? Forget the futures price for a moment. It's a lagging indicator in a situation like this, influenced by too many variables and too much institutional intervention to be a clean signal. The most honest, unmanipulated, real-world indicator available to any American right now is dealer premiums, not the spot price. The premium above spot that your local coin dealer, APMEX, JM Bullion, or Kitco, is actually charging for physical silver. That number is set by people with real inventory and real customers, not by algorithms running paper contracts. When dealer premiums spike past $5 to $8 per ounce above spot, it means the vault math is already speaking louder than the futures price. It means physical holders are pricing in scarcity that the paper market hasn't admitted to yet. Watch for that number by Friday morning. Watch whether it holds above $5 into next week. That spread is your early warning system, and it costs nothing to monitor. Beyond the immediate delivery window, 4 specific catalysts are lined up between now and midsummer that will determine whether this situation resolves or escalates into something the financial press can no longer ignore. Tomorrow, February 27th, is first notice day itself, when we get the first hard delivery number. By the end of trading tomorrow, we'll know how many March contract holders have formally filed for physical delivery. That number will either confirm that the paper-to-physical gap is being tested in the way the math suggests it should be, or it will show that most holders rolled or settled and the immediate crisis has a longer fuse. Either way, it's real data replacing projection, and it matters. March 17th and 18th bring the Federal Open Market Committee rate decision, and that meeting carries unusual weight right now. If the Fed signals rate cuts in a market where silver is already under physical supply pressure, the combination of monetary easing and supply squeeze creates an environment where silver's historical role as an inflation hedge gets repriced at exactly the moment its physical availability is most constrained. Rate cut expectations and physical scarcity are a powerful compound. Ask anyone who watched gold in 2008 and 2009. May 15th marks the anticipated transition at the Federal Reserve itself, as Jerome Powell's term concludes, and Kevin Warsh, widely regarded as more inflation-tolerant and institutionally flexible, is positioned to step into the chair. Leadership transitions at the Fed create uncertainty about the policy trajectory for the following 12 to 18 months. When that uncertainty coincides with the commodities market already under structural stress, institutional investors tend to accelerate their moves into hard assets as a hedge against policy unpredictability. Silver, already squeezed on the physical supply side, would absorb a new wave of investment demand precisely when it can least afford to. And then there's July 24th, the expiration of the current tariff window when a set of trade policy decisions come up for review or renewal. Tariff uncertainty creates import cost pressure across the industrial metals complex. And silver's dual identity as both an industrial metal and a monetary asset makes it particularly sensitive to trade policy shifts. If the tariff environment tightens further, the cost of moving silver across borders, already elevated by China's export restrictions and Mexico's transport paralysis, becomes even more prohibitive, and the case for holding domestic physical inventory gets stronger at every level of the supply chain, from mining company to retail investor. Here's what all of this means for you, practically and directly. We are not at a moment that calls for panic. Panic is never a strategy, and it rarely leads to good financial decisions, but we are absolutely at a moment that calls for awareness, the kind of clear-eyed, data-grounded awareness that lets you see what's happening in our financial systems before the mainstream narrative catches up to the reality on the ground. The vault math is not a rumor. The China export restrictions are documented policy. The Mexico disruption is front-page news in the country it's happening in, even if it hasn't made front-page news here. The CME margin increases are published exchange data. The Samsung contract is public record. Every piece of this story is verifiable. Every number is sourced. And the pattern they form together, tight inventory, sealed supply routes, sophisticated buyers moving early, exchange risk signals flashing, is a pattern that our financial history shows us how to read. Silver has been money for thousands of years, long before Comex existed, long before futures contracts were invented, long before any exchange decided how many paper claims could be written against a single ounce of metal. The physical reality of silver, its scarcity, its industrial necessity, its role in the solar panels powering our future and the electronics connecting our present, doesn't change because a paper market is under stress. If anything, stress reveals it more clearly. Watch the dealer premiums. Watch the first notice day delivery numbers. Watch what happens in Mexico over the next 2 weeks. And understand that the most powerful thing any of us can do in a moment like this is simply to see it clearly. Without fear, without panic, and without the comfortable illusion that the number on the screen is the whole story. Because right now in the vaults beneath Lower Manhattan, the whole story is written in ounces, and there aren't enough of them